Last week, we looked at this period of time where, obviously, the previous week, Jesus had just left this house where he healed the paralyzed man. Then he was walking down the street. He ended up at the tax collecting office. He walked into the tax collecting office. He found this guy that was in there working in the tax collecting office named Matthew. He walked into this guy's workplace. He's like, "Follow me." He found him at work, walked in there and just told him to follow him. The Bible says that he got up, he left everything, he followed Jesus. And to me, that's already just thinking about that's already an incredible challenge to us. Because it's the guy's living his life, he's doing what he's supposed to be doing, he's working. Jesus jumps in the middle of that. He leaves everything and he follows Jesus. And we have to recognize that this is still just a man. He's not, I think sometimes we over glorify the disciples, the apostles, they're some super Christians that we could never aspire to be. But these were people. They were just people. They're people that are going to be empowered by the Spirit of God for his work, but that same Spirit of God resides inside of us as well. These were just mere men. And I think sometimes we over glorify them, well, God would never call me to something like that, or I couldn't do something like that. They were people. God's plans and God's purposes haven't changed at all. So to me, it's a challenge to see a man respond to God like that, because we still can. Right after Jesus called Matthew's first act as his disciple was to throw a huge feast for Jesus at his house. And what we looked at last week, and we saw that Matthew invited a bunch of tax collectors, his co-workers, and a bunch of sinners. It's kind of a synonymous term there still, tax collectors and sinners. But he invited a bunch of tax collectors and sinners to his house. And these religious elite guys are like, why is Jesus sitting at a table with all of these people? All of these kinds of people. Why is Jesus having anything to do with these kinds of people? That's that's a really sad way to think. Obviously they didn't understand who he was, but even just to have thoughts like that about people, that's a sad basis to be operating from. And so Jesus engaged with these guys and he's like, I came like a doctor. He's like, I came for the sick. I didn't come for people that think that they are perfectly healthy and don't need me. I came for people that realize that they need me. And we saw Jesus sitting at the table with a bunch of people that definitively needed him. Because even people were judging these people, saying oh, these terrible people. They needed Jesus. Jesus was with the sick people. He was the doctor that was at the table with sick people that needed him. And so when we think about that's where we left off last week. But that's still that seeing Jesus in that situation, I think still very much leads into where we are going to be at this morning, and to see his heart and his compassion for people. And it's something I want to pay close attention to, because it's something that we need. So, with all of that said, let's read our passage for today. We're going to be reading 14 through 38, through the very end of the chapter. And it's going to seem wow, there's a lot of different things here, but I think we're going to see that we can connect together and see this whole point through here. But 14 through 38, Matthew 9, it says, Then the disciples of John came to him saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, Can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break. The wine is spilled and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. While he spoke these things to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, My daughter has just died. But come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, If only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, "Be of good cheer, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And the woman was made well from that hour. And Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, and he said to them, "Make room, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when the crowd was put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose, and the report of this went out into all of the land. When Jesus departed from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out and saying, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And when he had come into the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes, and saying, "According to your faith, let it be to you." And their eyes were opened. And Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows it." And when they had departed, they spread the news about him in all that country. And they went out, and behold, they brought to him a man, mute and demon-possessed. And when the demon was cast out, the mute spoke. And the multitudes marveled, saying, "It was never seen like this in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "He casts out demons by the rulers of demons." Then Jesus, and pay attention to this, verse 35, says, "Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep, having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest.'" It's a lot of verses, but I want to see through this how I believe that the example that we saw in Jesus last week can carry through this entire passage that we see today. The first part of our passage today, I mean, it seems like it potentially is kind of disjointed in here. The first part of our passage is about fasting. We've talked about fasting a little bit before when we talked about some of the spiritual disciplines that Jesus dealt with earlier in this book. But this first part, there's a question that is posed to Jesus, and it's a question about fasting. And it's interesting because the question this time, like all the last weeks, like all of the questioning and all the weird kind of conversations and stuff that have been brought into the mix of things have usually been brought by the scribes and the Pharisees. That's who we've usually seen coming into the middle of these situations. But this question today, and in this part of this chapter, this question is actually coming from the disciples of John, which, if you remember back to the beginning of the book, it's the disciples of John the Baptist. That's the guys that are coming at this moment and asking this question of Jesus. And so these guys, they come up to Jesus and they're like, "We fast all the time. Like the Pharisees fast all of the time. So why don't your people that follow you, why don't they fast?" Like they're questioning Jesus on this thing. It's almost like, I don't know, when I read this, it's almost like there's like some competition going on in these guys' heads. I mean, that's how I read it. It's like, we don't know like the heart from which, maybe it's just a genuine question of like, why don't they do that? But it's almost coming from it seems like it might be coming from a weird place of like, some competitiveness even between these people. It's like, we fast, even these guys fast, you guys don't do it. Like what's wrong with, it's like, if you are who you say you are, and these are the guys that are following you, then like, why aren't they as spiritual as we are? I mean, it's almost kind of like what it seems like is being asked here. And even, when I look at this from even regular people dynamics, it's like, again, these are just assumptions, but like are these guys maybe even like, we want to be your disciples, and look, we're like more spiritual than these guys. Like, we're already doing more than them. Like, they're coming to Jesus with this question. So it's like, for us, like, what's the deal? Like, what's the deal with the question and this conversation about fasting? But Jesus obviously engages with these guys. He engages with this question. That question was in verse 14. But Jesus engages with these questions, and we have to understand something. Like I said, these weren't the Pharisees. Most of the questions we've been seeing lately have been from the Pharisees and the scribes. These were the disciples of John. And I actually think that these guys were likely, fasting in the right way. They were probably fasting humbly and in reverence to the Lord in their fasting. But they were also likely fasting for like preparation for Jesus' coming and Jesus' ministry. Because if we remember, like John's role, if you remember back to the beginning of this book, John's role was to prepare the way for the Lord. It's like he's not Jesus. John's role was the guy that kind of came before and said, there is one coming that you need to be ready for. That was John's role, is to prepare the way for the Lord. And so these guys, in their fasting and in their spiritual disciplines, and they're really in this like preparation mode for Jesus. That's what these guys are involved in. But then we see, obviously, the next group of people that they give, like, well, the Pharisees fast too. We've kind of already gone over that. The Pharisees did a lot of stuff. But unfortunately, they did a lot of stuff for the wrong reasons. Oftentimes, the Pharisees were doing what they were doing for like their own self-righteousness and for pride. That's really what the reason was that they did a lot of the things that they did. They were trying to impress people. Jesus' disciples were not fasting. And so Jesus is like going to deal with why that's the case. And he uses an analogy to do this. When we look at it practically, it's like, well, I mean, it's probably a good thing that they weren't trying to just impress people like the Pharisees. But we can also look in contrast to John's disciples as they weren't in preparation mode for Jesus' coming ministry because they were right in the middle of Jesus' ministry. They were right there next to him. And so when Jesus talks to these guys and he engages with this question, he uses an analogy in verse 15. Jesus says to them, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? I think when we look at that, it's like, what in the world does that mean? Like, in our culture right now, I don't think that there's a really easily relatable thing to this. So it requires us to understand a little bit about the culture at that time. The culture, the Jewish culture at that time, when there was a wedding, when a couple got married, there was this time where it wasn't like our culture now, where usually, not everybody, but usually, couples married and then they go away on a honeymoon for a little while. They do something or they take a little time away or whatever. But in the culture then, when the marriage happened, it usually was the couple stayed at home, and then it was like an open house for usually like a week after the wedding. And it was during that time, after the wedding, it was just a time of celebration. And so all the closest friends of the bride and groom through that whole week, they were at their house. The house was open. There was festivities and parties and eating. And there was almost this like treating of the bride and groom as like a king and a queen. And they treated them well for this whole week and partied and had all these festivities with the bride and groom. So it was a time of great celebration. There was like for a week following the wedding. It's a little different from the culture that we have right now. But when we think about that, that's the picture that Jesus has in mind, because he's saying here, he says, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? He has this picture of, like, it's this time of the party, like it's the time of the festivities, like my people right here around me, like they're with me in that week of celebration right now. He's like, why would they be fasting right now or downcast or any of these things? Because right now is the time for celebration. They're with me right now. That's the point that Jesus is making. These guys, obviously one group was doing it out of pride. One group was doing it to get ready for Jesus. One group wasn't doing it at this point in time because they were literally with him at that moment. And to us, that's also, something to look forward to, because the fasting and such, and we're going to talk about it a little bit, but it is that changing of us, and in that humility and that lowering of ourselves to get closer to the Lord and to hear what he has to say and all of these things. But we see that in the presence of Jesus, like there's joy and celebration and all of those things. And that's what these guys were in the middle of then, and it's what we have to look forward to in the future, because one day we will be with him. If you believe in him, if he is your Savior, we will be with him. And at that point, we won't need to fast any longer, because we will be with him at that point. But these guys were there right now. But Jesus also qualifies this statement. He qualifies it for a reason. He says, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? Like, he's like, it's not time for them to be downcast and to fast and to deal with these things right now because they're with me right now. But at the end of verse 15 it says, but the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Jesus lets them know. He lets them know it's like this period of time is not going to be forever. He lets them know that this time that he is with them is going to come to an end. At that point, it will be time for his people to fast. It's interesting that Jesus is giving them a little glimpse of the future at this point. Like he's letting them know. He's letting them know that he is physically not going to be with them forever. I wonder, like when they're hearing this analogy, like even there at that moment, I wonder what's going through. I wonder if they're understanding at all what he's saying. He's like, I'm not going to be with you forever. And that point when I'm not with you, then things are going to change. Things are going to change and you're going to need to fast. And there's going to be other ways that you're going to have to deal with these things because I'm not going to be physically with you at that moment. He's telling them these things. I don't know if they're completely getting it. It doesn't tell us. But it's interesting that he's having this conversation with them. He's telling them what's coming. And for some, it's like, some of them are really new to this. Like Matthew just got called to follow Jesus like moments before this situation. And now Jesus is already telling you, I'm not going to be with you guys forever. Like, that's interesting. Like, he's so new to this, so he might not have any idea what Jesus is talking about. We don't know. But Jesus is explaining this situation to this other guy. He says it's not time for them to fast yet, but the time will be coming. And Jesus gives two more analogies. He gives two more analogies in verses 16 and 17. He says, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch falls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break, the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. Again, it's like, what do these mean in the middle of? But when you break down what Jesus is saying, he's making a really strong point here. He's looking at trying to make something new work with something that is old. You have the new cloth and that patch being added to an old piece of fabric. That's the first analogy. Then he has new wine that he's talking about that's being added to an old wineskin. And we look at that and we're like, well, why doesn't that work? Well, even for us now, when we think of, you have like cotton clothing or whatever, if you take a brand new piece of fabric and you put it onto a piece of clothing that's been washed and dried a whole bunch of times before, that new piece of fabric is going to try to shrink when it is washed and dried. And so if you try to patch the old fabric with the new fabric, when the new one shrinks, it's either going to deform the clothing because all the clothing is going to shrink around that patch and it's going to make the clothing look weird, or it might shrink to the point where it just rips away from the other fabric and it creates a bigger hole than what you had before. It's an interesting analogy. Same thing with the wineskins. He's like, well, you put new wine in a new wineskin because if you try to put new wine in an old wineskin, it'd be a problem. And the reason why that is because the wine continues to ferment and gases come off of it. And as it sits inside of a leather wineskin, it actually hardens the leather. It expands and makes it just the right size for the wine that's in it. But if you try to put that same new wine into an old wineskin that is already shaped and gone through that sizing process, it will still release the gases. It will still try to expand and all of those things. But if it's hard and it's stuck in the shape that it is now, that when it tries to expand, it's going to blow it up. And so the point that he is making is that things are changing. There is an old way of doing things. There's old purposes that we had, but there's also a new way of doing things. And there's new purposes that we have. Jesus is right in the middle of that because he is the thing that's changing everything. He is the person that is changing everything. For some of these guys, like when he's talking about fasting, he's like, you guys probably did fasting just out of duty and habit, and some of these guys for pride and for all of those things. He's like, but there is a completely new way of doing things, and don't try to fit these new things that I'm teaching. Don't just try to shove the new things I'm teaching you into your old way of doing things. And sometimes that's something we have to take to heart too, because sometimes we're not good with change. And sometimes we're still trying to take the old way of doing things and to shove new things into it. And sometimes we have to stop and realize maybe the old way of doing things wasn't working for a reason. Like, I think of that even in, I think about that even in church culture. In church culture, I think sometimes we're very adverse to change. And sometimes, certain things don't need to change. Like, we don't change what we talk about. The truth doesn't change. All of those things. These people at this moment, they were dealing with this period of time where they were coming right out of the old covenant and the systems of sacrifices and the way they engaged with God and all of those things. And God prescribed pretty much all of those ways that they were to deal with him. But at that moment in time, they lived under the law of God. And they needed these sacrifices and stuff to deal with things. But everything was changing now when the point where Jesus is going to die for our sins. And they move from under the law to now under the very grace of God. That changes everything. It changes how we are saved in Jesus. It changes even the ways in which we should be living and things that we should be living for. And I think for us, as we consider these things, like I said, the truth for us doesn't change. These things are set in stone. We don't change what the Bible says, period. We don't. It's all good. It's all valid. Even the parts pre-Jesus, there's still so much to learn from that about who God is and his standard of living for people. It teaches us about our sin and why we need Jesus. There's still so much value in that, but things begin to change at Jesus. And Jesus is warning these people, saying, don't be completely just so stuck in your ways that you won't hear what I have to say and follow me. You can stay in all of your traditions and all of the ways you've always done everything, but maybe that's not what's right, because we need to listen to him and be willing and ready to follow him without being so stuck in our ways that we won't. Like I said, I feel like sometimes we see that even in church culture. I think sometimes we're very adverse to change. We don't change the truth, but maybe sometimes we do have to reconsider the ways that we are engaging with the community, the way that we are caring for each other, the way that we're even gathering in church. For us, it was a really big, different change to have church in a house. It's a different thing, and it's a change. And we've had conversations with people that were even adverse to church being in a house. It's supposed to be different. Oh no, the Bible's original, layout for church showed this as the starting point. And why? And again, that's not that everything needs to change away from that. It's we can still, even in the moment right now, recognize that maybe everything we've been doing isn't necessarily the right thing. Sometimes we're so adverse to change that we're when some great idea for the kingdom of God comes, maybe we come with, and I've been there in these moments where I've been in conversations where a really good idea for the kingdom of God comes. People are excited. Somebody wants to lead or engage in some way to serve for the kingdom of God. And it's met with, but that's not the way we've always done it. And it's just but then we stop and we really think about it. It's well, the way that we've always been doing it for all this time, it seems to be really ineffective in this area. It seems like it's not accomplishing what it's supposed to be accomplishing. If we as a church are supposed to be reaching people, if we're supposed to be growing as disciples of Jesus Christ, if we are supposed to be, if the church as a whole is supposed to be making active disciples of Jesus and that's not happening, then we have to ask what needs to change, because the church isn't accomplishing its purpose in this world. We have to be okay with that. But it's always hear what Jesus has to say, listen to what he has to say, and do what he wants us to do. But sometimes that changes based on, a local context of a church. Maybe it changes with the times. We don't do church the same exact way they did in the 1600s. It's not the same truth, but it's not the same way of doing things. And if we are wanting to engage our culture and engage people, because culture is changing, the world's changing rapidly. And we don't compromise the truth for culture, but we look at culture and say, what can we do, and maybe even do differently to better reach people for the kingdom of God with the gospel of Jesus Christ. But if we're against even having that conversation, then I think we'll be really ineffective. And Jesus is telling these people, like, don't just take the new stuff and try to shove it into the old, because it's probably going to be disastrous. So there was very specific to them, but I think it gives us something to think about even right now, even as we think about what we're going to be doing. Right now, where we're at in time, that Jesus said to these people, he said, my disciples don't need to fast right now because they're with me, but they'll need to fast when I'm gone. That's what he said in those first verses. We're in the while he's gone part. Like, we're in the middle. Like, Jesus died, he ascended, he went back to sit at the right hand of the Father in heaven, and he's not physically here right now. We are in my disciples will need to fast while I'm gone. We're in the middle of that part. That includes us. So when we consider what fasting is, and we consider what Jesus is talking about here, fasting is purposed to humble us and bring us closer to the Lord. It is to hopefully kill some of our self-reliance and I can take care of everything, look what I can do, and put that and lean it completely on the Lord. It's to lean on his power. It's to make less of us and to make more of him. It's to bring us to a place where we are humbly reliant upon him. And we're listening so that we can follow his direction. Fasting should help us follow Jesus. That's why, like, they were following him physically, but they were going to need help to follow him when he wasn't there. And fasting was one of the ways that Jesus was planning for them to be able to do that. He said fasting should help us follow him, and it should help make us more like him. There's a passage that I really love, and you can turn to Isaiah chapter 58. But I do want to read in a different version. So while you guys go to Isaiah 58, I'm going to use Nikki's phone here, and I'm going to bring it up on here. Sometimes I want you to read it in whatever translation you have, but sometimes some of the older passages are, they can be a little difficult to follow through with sometimes. But I feel like I'm going to read this from there's a newer translation of the Bible, and it's not like the one that I use as my main translation, but sometimes it's very helpful because it's just worded really clearly. So this is actually in the NLT version, but this is worded very clearly to understand it as you follow it. So Isaiah chapter 58, and this entire chapter is about fasting, and I think that we will see in this passage the heart and compassion of Christ that we saw even as he met with tax collectors and sinners, that will carry all the way through this passage, how fasting will connect us to the heart of Christ. So Isaiah 58, and I said I'm going to read it out of the NLT version because it's very clear. It says, "Shout with the voice of a trumpet blast. Shout aloud, don't be timid. Tell my people Israel of their sins. Yet they act so pious. They come to the temple every day and seem delighted to learn all about me. They act like a righteous nation that would never abandon the laws of its God. They ask me to take action on their behalf, pretending they want to be near me. We have fasted before you, they say. Why aren't you impressed? We have been very hard on ourselves, and you don't even notice it. I will tell you why," I respond. "It's because you are fasting to please yourselves. Even while you fast, you keep oppressing your workers. What good is fasting when you keep on fighting and quarreling? This kind of fasting will never get you anywhere with me. You humble yourselves by going through the motions of penance, bowing your heads like reeds bending in the wind. You dress in burlap and cover yourself with ashes. Is this what you call fasting? Do you really think this will please the Lord?" Now, this whole first set of 5 verses, this is basically what the Pharisees were doing. This is what they were doing. And God's like, do you really think that impresses me? Do you really think when you do all of these things, when you're going through all of these motions and you're still treating people bad while you're doing it and all these things, you think that impresses me? That's what God is saying here. First 5 verses, this is very much a correlation like what the Pharisees were doing. They were doing things in the wrong way for the wrong reasons. But then it shifts, and God talks about what he's really looking for. In verse 6 of Isaiah 58, He says, no, this is the kind of fasting I want. It says, free those who are wrongfully imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry. Give shelter to the homeless. Give clothes to those who need them. And do not hide from relatives who need your help. Then your salvation will come like the dawn, and your wounds will quickly heal. Your godliness will lead you forward, and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. Then you will call. The Lord will answer. Yes, I am here, he will quickly reply. Remove the heavy yoke of oppression. Stop pointing your finger and spreading vicious rumors. Feed the hungry. Help those in trouble. Then your light will shine out from the darkness, and the darkness around you will be as bright as noon. The Lord will guide you continually, giving you water when you are dry and restoring your strength. You will be like a well-watered garden, like an ever-flowing spring. Some of you will rebuild the deserted ruins of your cities. Then you will be known as a rebuilder of the walls and a restorer of homes. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Don't pursue your own interests on that day, but enjoy the Sabbath and speak of it with delight as the Lord's holy day. Honor the Sabbath in everything you do on that day, and don't follow your own desires or talk idly. Then the Lord will be your delight. I will give you great honor and satisfy you with the inheritance I promised to your ancestor Jacob. I, the Lord, have spoken. This was God talking through the prophet Isaiah. But you see this, and he's like, some of you guys are fasting like this. Very much like the Pharisees are doing in this situation. God's like, you really think I am impressed by that? Like, he's like, I am God. You think your little act of making yourself look bad and still treating people wrong and thinking that you're righteous, you really think that that's impressing me? God's like, it's not. He's like, the fast that I want to see from my people, it should lead to all of these other things. Like when we look at fasting through the lens of that chapter in Isaiah, we see that God says like our fasting and our like humbling and our getting close to him, our calling out to him, it should lead to like care and compassion for other people. It should lead to a definitive reliance upon the Lord. It's us like calling out for help to him and him answering. It says answering quickly. We see through that passage that it leads to health for us, but also for our families. It even leads to community restoration. Like these are all big deal issues. They're huge. And those things are at the end of the line from humbling ourselves truly in reverence before an almighty God, leaning on him completely, relying upon him completely, having our heart merged with his, like leading our heart towards his. Like when we make so much less of us in fasting in front of him, the goal is to get closer to his heart, to be more like his son, and to follow him in his ways. We see through the passage in Isaiah, and that was written long before Jesus, but Jesus said, my people aren't fasting right now, but they will need to. Like they can follow me right now because I'm doing this work. I'm helping these people. They're right in the middle of it with me. But there's going to come a time when I'm not here, and they still need to be about these things. So he says there will come a time when my people need to fast because there's still going to be so much work to be done. And it's one of the ways that God is going to use to help them get there. It's something we don't talk about, I think, enough. But I think it's important. And obviously, like we've talked about before, the fasting in these passages, it talks about an actual like stopping of eating food. You know, a lot of people fast in different ways. And I'm not saying that that's not beneficial at different times. But the way that the Bible talks about it in these times is specifically a full stop of eating food. And sometimes that's not, the healthiest thing for everybody at a specific point in time. Put that before the Lord and ask him what he would have you do. But that's what it's talking about, is stopping something that we absolutely need, feeling the effects of that. Like feeling the effects of the hunger and using even that time that we would be eating and while we're feeling those things as a reminder to take me back to him, to take me back to him, to be more like him, to walk through what Jesus has walked through, to understand, to get a little bit more of his heart. And through all of those processes, hopefully, begin to be more like Jesus, and in being more like Jesus, act towards other people like Jesus would act. Like that passage spells that out so clearly. I love that it says there that it's just like that passage, that part of that passage that just says that, in godliness, like we'll walk forward in godliness, but it says right behind us, it says the glory of God is following behind us. And it says like the healing will come in the midst of walking that way. It says like some of us will be used to help restore the ruins of our city, to restore homes and restore all of it. It's like, I really want us to be a part of that. Like I really want us to experience that. Fasting is one of the ways that we get there. When we see this, and we're not going to read through all of these other passages, but we see this. We see last week, Jesus with sinners and tax collectors. Then he starts out this, and he's answering this question about fasting. I think it's also leading about his people, how they engage with people, and why they will need to fast in these ways. We see Jesus begin to even further exemplify this. And those next passages, like I said, we read through them all. All of the passages where he's healing people in 18 through 26, we see this ruler and his daughter that had passed away, and Jesus goes and raises her to life. Absolutely incredible. We see this woman with the flow of blood, that she has faith in the Lord, and she's like, if I just touch his clothes, I know I'll be healed. Jesus heals her. We see that Jesus engages with these two guys that are blind. They absolutely believe that Jesus can heal them. He heals them. We see Jesus run into, once again, another mute and demon-possessed man. Jesus casts out the demon, heals the man, and he's good at that point. Like we see Jesus talking about what his disciples are engaged with, and then we see Jesus literally go out, care for people, heal people, engage with people, practically help people. Again, like we may not be able to do the miraculous work that Jesus is doing in this moment. But the thing is, we also know him. Like we know him, and we can still call out to the God who is able to do these things. There's some, peoples and churches out there that will teach you like that you can learn how to heal people, or you can learn how to use these different, like, no, we know a God. Like the power will never be rooted in us, but we know a God, and we know the God that is doing this right now. So it's like I don't put anything past the Lord and what he is able to do. But what I want to see in this passage is Jesus is tangibly and practically caring for people. People have needs. People are hurting. People are struggling. He is helping them. That's part of his ministry. Jesus isn't just going and talking at people. Jesus is actually helping people. And I think sometimes we don't see that in Jesus' ministry. Like I've been in a lot of conversations where it's like, we just go talk to people. Like that's the whole role of the church, and that's what outreach looks like. We just go talk to people. But a lot of times the bridge of the gospel is built over loving and helping people. It's like the bridge to that gospel conversation a lot of times is built and is easier to cross over when we have the opportunity to tangibly love, help, and care for people. It opens up the door to the conversation and say, the only reason I'm here is Jesus. I'd love to tell you about him. And for me, that's hard because it's like, I'm not the best cold conversation person. Like it's hard for me to walk up and just have a cold conversation with people. It's not something God has really made me good at. I'm not a very good conversationalist and such, but I'd love to help you. And maybe through that, we'll get somewhere in conversation because it'll put us in a place where maybe we have to talk about it. To me, that's helpful. And that's always the goal. The goal is always to get to the gospel. But get to the gospel, I think the gospel comes a lot of times through that pathway of help. But what we see through this, like I said, we see Jesus helping people. Don't ever miss that in Jesus' ministry. Jesus taught, he preached. It's going to say that again in these last verses. He taught, he preached, he discipled the disciples. He had these conversations with people. But don't ever miss the fact that Jesus was often and all the time actually helping in people's situations and in people's lives. That was a big part of his ministry. When we get to verses 35 to 38, it says, Jesus went about all of the cities, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to the disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray that the Lord of the harvest will send out laborers into his harvest. Jesus was going town to town, city to city. He was teaching. He was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. We have to do that. We do. We need to. But it also says that he was healing people. He was actively caring for and ministering to people. That was part of his mission. It was one of the specific parts of his people engagement. He taught, he preached, and he helped. Imagine that. Imagine even just being in one of those situations and Jesus walks into the room and Jesus is there to help. People actually got helped personally by Jesus. That's incredible. That's really incredible. That's a story to tell the grandkids at that time. To think about that. It's sometimes I think we just have these stories, but there are people that were actually living and breathing, and Jesus walked into the situation and helped. We still have an opportunity to be his representatives and still walk into those rooms and into those places and into those situations and help, just like he did. We always need to be ready to share the gospel, but sometimes we need to just help. And hopefully that helping becomes the bridge to the gospel. And I think there's a lot of people that go out, and maybe even with good intentions, but they go out and they yell at people, they scream at people, they judge people, condemn people. How in the world does that work at all with what Jesus did? When I see Jesus and I see how he engaged with people, there's something so wrong about that. Because that's not what Jesus was doing. When we see Jesus' heart here, it says he went through all of these places. He saw all of these people. He's God. We've seen in previous passages, he literally knows what's on the heart and mind of people without them even speaking. He's done that in this chapter. He's seeing all of these people. He knows their darkest secrets. He knows the sin. He knows all of the issues. It says that he looked at the multitudes and he was moved with compassion for them. He saw people that were weary and scattered like sheep that didn't have a shepherd. Jesus looked at the people and didn't just see problems. He didn't just see people as a burden to himself or to society. He looked at people and had compassion. For me, that makes me just stop to consider. When I see Jesus' heart, like I said, we started last week at Jesus at the table, tax collectors and sinners, and people are like, why would he ever be around those people? Jesus knew that they needed him. He had compassion for them. He was caring for, he was loving them. He was teaching this lesson this morning about his disciples that they're still going to need to be about these things. And they're going to probably have to fast and go deeper and grow and all. And so they would be prepared to be still about the same mission that I'm doing, of caring for people, having compassion for people. Jesus then exemplified that. He went out, he was healing people, he was helping people. And then it comes to this end point, and we see in his heart and in his eyes as he's looking at people, compassion for others. And I ask us today, how do we view other people? How do we see other people that we're seeing? What response do we have for other people? Maybe when we see someone that's struggling, Maybe somebody's struggling because they're unhoused right now. They don't have somewhere to live. How do we view that person? Maybe somebody's struggling with addiction. How do we view that person? Maybe someone's just struggling with enough means to provide for their household. Maybe somebody's struggling with mental health. Maybe somebody's struggling with sickness and disease. Maybe somebody's caught up in gangs. Maybe somebody just got caught up in really poor choices. How do we look at a teen mom? How do we view that situation? Jesus looked across the masses, across the multitudes, and he had compassion. I just ask us, what do we have when we look across all of the different peoples that we see? Do we look at them from different viewpoints of this person's a burden on society or whatever? No, really? Maybe it's time to change. Maybe it's the old way of doing things. Maybe we collectively should be doing more to help people out of situations. Maybe we as a church need to be pursuing discipleship to help people grow through situations. It's to deal with situations and to come out the other side stronger. I said there was a lot of weary, scattered, and shepherdless people that Jesus was looking at. The great thing is we know the shepherd. Through last week's passage, through this week's passage, we see his heart. Please, 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 if we have a weird way of thinking, let's just get rid of that. Out with the old and in with Jesus' heart, Jesus' way of viewing people. Jesus, again, like we talked about before, it's not about not being wise with people. Some people are going to be out to have real problems. We need to be wise about those things. But generally, we look at people, and hopefully how other people have even looked at us in times past, because we ain't perfect and we probably had problems in our life and times and where things, and it's I would hope that even in that moment people would have looked at us with compassion. I don't know all of the ways where people get to the places that they're at, but I know that one of the roots of all of it is sin. I know that same root was in me, and I know Jesus was the only thing that changed it. And so in compassion, I want the same for them. And again, that's not a judgment thing, that's a love thing. And maybe fasting, if it's something you've never engaged with before. Jesus said his disciples are going to need it. Maybe we need it too. Maybe it will help us get us out of our own heads and out of our own thought processes and get to his heart and his goals. So, let me pray.